All right.
And think. Take a class from the Riker method of getting the chairs.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
And then come straight over to the
Yeah,
back.
you can just relax. We tested out the sound.
I know, buddy, and we've got chairs now. This is
We've got
dope.
chairs.
Good
Yeah,
idea.
we just we found a box we could put our mic on. So it took
Only took 13 episodes.
Exactly. Hey, 13 is our lucky number.
Exactly. So today.
Yes. Let's see.
Today is the 12th.
12th of February.
2021.
Yes.
1:43 p.m.
1:43 p.m.
And I thought, I feel like we really started to hit our stride with the last 3 or 4 pods.
Yeah, this week's been really good so far.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I figured we would try and keep that going by talking about something that I know is very close to your heart.
Yeah, and you have a very good interest in it as well. So.
Thank you. And that is climate change.
Yes.
So I think you should debate the for climate change's existence, and I'll debate the against, and we'll figure it out from there.
Okay, there we go.
No, I'm just kidding. Climate change is real.
You're not getting any checks from the oil lobby these days, are you?
I wish, man.
Oh, man.
So, climate change is real. It's an important factor in so much of what's going on now.
Definitely.
And, I think it's a good thing for us to mark right now, because it's something I feel like in the future we're going to look back at and we're going to have things to say.
Definitely about climate change for sure.
So I figure we should talk about our ideas about climate change and our perspectives. But I think the best place to start is probably just the state of the world, the state of the climate in the world, the changes you've seen around the world due to climate change so far.
Definitely.
You're super on top of this topic, and I think to sort of bring you into that, let's sort of roll it back all the way to the beginning. Your folks are like, this is one of their passionate topics.
Definitely.
They're all about the environment.
Absolutely.
Talk to me about growing up under that influence and what your first sort of encounters with the idea of climate change were like.
I remember learning about climate change when I was pretty young. I was lucky in that way. This was not something that was necessarily discussed with every kid growing up, especially when we were growing up. I think it's a lot more prevalent nowadays.
Totally.
But yeah, when I was growing up, it was an interesting time in the environmental movement. I think, I have my dad's perspective, who's very much trying to locate climate change in the context of a sort of spiritual relationship with the earth, and he's looking at different faith traditions, including like in the Catholic faith, like how we should live with the earth as religious or spiritual people is one of the big things he wrestles with. So that was an influence on my life growing up.
Very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And it's outside of that kind of familial perspective, I'm sure you remember this as well, but there was a lot of stuff when we were growing up, and we were young.
We're talking sort of early 2000s here.
Exactly, yeah, early 2000s here, when we were young enough to be very impressionable, but old enough to start kind of really wrestling with these things a little bit. It was very much about kind of buying certain eco-friendly products. There was about recycling, reduce, reuse, recycle, the big 3 R's. Mm-hmm. That's how I remember kind of my first dose of environmental education was around that. And there was a sense of that we're not doing things properly. But at the same time that it's on the kind of individual to change their actions to fix that. Yeah. I don't know if that's fair, but those are kind of the things I remember growing up with in the kind of surrounding culture talking about this. Like, we should recycle more. We should reduce, reuse more. We should change our lifestyle habits in order to save the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was talk about things like reducing your reliance on fossil fuels.
Yes.
But it was always, back then I think it was always reduction. It was never this idea that started to grow up now, we're really of elimination.
Yes.
Just leaving this stuff in the ground.
That's right.
So that's your sort of early chunk there.
Yeah.
I vaguely remember similar sort of stuff. I think I got some of it through school.
Yep.
But for me, in terms of, I think climate change is just kind of woven into the idea of climate and
Yes.
period.
Yes, absolutely.
So are there any sort of milestone moments in those sort of early years, maybe going into the 2010s?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I remember learning about kind of the big conferences, these big international conferences that happened. There was the Copenhagen conference in 2009, and I remember it vividly because my dad got stuck in Copenhagen because he had problems with his papers coming back into Canada. He wasn't a citizen of Canada at that time, and I think he had let something slide, and he had to stay there for a little while. So I remember that really vividly, and I remember him talking to him about it. And
so when was that? Sorry,
that was about 2009, late 2009, early 2010, if I remember. So that was a big moment. I remember the international community seemed to be starting to take this very seriously. There was it was kind of unfortunate because at that time President Obama sort of went AWOL, and there had been all these kind of international discussions of what the agreement should be, and then kind of President Obama pulled out of it and said, we're going to go unilateral on this, we're not really fitting in with the general global strategy, and China then left the table in a large way, and it all started to fall apart, unfortunately. So that was a big moment. I kind of remember in early high school, and I remember I was like writing letters to like the certain people in the Canadian government, just as a young kid, through different organizations that got you to do that, about, let's take this seriously, let's get on board with that. We're young people, we want to engage in the kind of political process. So I remember a bit about that, and that was a kind of milestone for me in early high school. That's where I'd say like I directly started to sort of kind of trying to learn outside of school what was going on a little bit. Yeah.
Did you get any replies from your early letters?
I did. I remember I got a reply because I was talking about sort of indigenous people. I left out the Métis, and someone was really kind enough to educate me on who the Métis were, and that was kind of cool. So I remember because we were back and forth, I was just mentioning that, and I had no idea who Métis people were. And that would come up later with the whole stuff around environmental justice, but we don't need to get into that right now. Maybe that's a little later. But at this point, it was kind of very much, focused on policy, focused on international cooperation or our lack of, and kind of just trying to learn about, as you learn about these issues, you learn about, how countries are trying to deal with them at that time.
Totally.
Yeah. How about you? Do you remember anything from around that period, like high school or early high school?
Well, I remember, so I had... at a certain point in middle school, I believe, and maybe even into high school, my mother brought me a subscription to the New Scientist magazine.
No, nice.
And a really solid mag, sort of an English, kind of popular science, but very, really, well, kind of popular science. It is popular science, but really aimed at sort of thinking and science knowledge, an audience of people who really know stuff about science.
Right.
And I really enjoyed reading those. And as you know, the consensus on climate change has been really solid for decades.
Long time.
I think probably the last of the stragglers really started to shift over in the 90s. So by the time I'm in the mid to late 2000s reading this stuff in the New Scientist, it's just sort of a reality of how people are talking about the climate. That being said, science and climate science in general, totally understandably, is hugely foggy.
Yes.
It's one of the real challenges that I think people have had trying to get ideas across to from climate scientists to other people.
Absolutely.
Is that they're very used to science just being, here's a thingy, this is how it works, as opposed to being like, this is this complicated, ethereal topic.
Definitely.
And we've done some statistical projections and we're pretty darn sure it's getting a lot worse.
Yes.
The climate is just that sort of complex.
Definitely. And to your point of that kind of this difficulty of, migrating information from the scientific community to like let's call it like the lay community or the just regular folks trying to understand these things.
Of course.
One of the big kind of things we grew up with in was the, really high point of the climate denial industry. Yeah, so we grew up in it where we were lucky to kind of have our peers and teachers and parents and just a collection of people who are
insulating us.
Insulating us from that and helping us with that. But something that I found amazing and kind of learning about a little later was just how deeply entrenched the denial industry and how much money has been behind it for a very long time.
Totally.
And it's been in vogue until very recently for certain segments to deny climate change. I think now that's shifting a little bit. It's harder and harder to deny climate change.
I think the strategies have started to move. Climate change has become such a part of the way people interact with ideas on the climate.
Exactly.
That these people who are, most of whom, fueled by money, based on the destruction of the environment, really, really want that money source to continue, even though they're already wealthier than that they have any real need to be.
No, exactly.
But climate denial stuff is such a bizarre topic in and of itself.
Yes.
I think for now let's sort of focus. We might even be able to do a whole episode. I think we could easily do a whole episode on many of these different subtopics.
Absolutely.
But let's look at. So that's the kind of ideas that surrounded climate change as we were growing up.
Yeah.
There was this conflict between climate denial and climate change and eventually climate crisis. There was an inconvenient truth.
Yes, that's right, with Al Gore.
which caused a big storm, but also got in a lot of trouble from climate scientists saying basically, you messed up a lot of stuff.
Right.
And I think there was, for a short time, there was a debate about whether or not he had actually made the cause worse. I think history has shown that just because people are taking climate change so much more seriously now, that he was just trying to contribute to that overall knowledge, and people ultimately don't have or need a really good idea of climate change other than to know that it's real, that humans are doing it, and that there's things that we need to do in the future in order for the planet not to go really far downhill.
No, exactly.
So hit me now with your sort of first recollections of events in the world that you felt were tied quite clearly to climate change.
Absolutely. So one of the big things I remember is over the last few years, the wildfires in this continent. Wildfires in this continent that are definitely not new to our forested regions, but the scope and scale, magnitude, and the difficulty in dealing with them are very new, and parts that have never experienced wildfires before to any sort of great magnitude. I'm looking at particularly along the West Coast, parts of California, the ones that have gotten really hit hard in the last few years, with horrific stories of just chaotic wildfires appearing almost out of nowhere. That, I think, is something that not only for me, but a lot of other people who might not have sort of been able to grasp visually what climate change looks like. That's an example of it that stands out in my mind.
And we have these really drastic images now of red skies over states that are 2 or 3 states away from
cars burning, And I remember it was the first time, I think it was on CNN, and I was in Tucson, Arizona, so I was in the belly of the beast in terms of a lot of climate change inducing organizations. A lot of them are kind of based in that area of the South, but they had a special on primetime about climate change, and that was the first time I'd really seen a mainstream U.S. organization devote an hour of primetime news to the issue of climate change around the United States. So that was that was a marker for me, and that was about 3 years ago that I saw that. So that for me is one moment that stands out in my mind in the last little while. Do you have a similar kind of moment or
I think one of the big ones for me was in 2012. There was an article in the New York Times science section that basically said, we have produced conclusive evidence that humans have already changed the climate. the only question going forwards is how much we can mitigate the damage we're doing.
Right.
And to a certain extent, this was just sort of like a more concrete example of the things that we already knew had occurred.
Mm-hmm.
But the way it was sort of presented, and this idea that, you know, we'd reached a point where, because people have been warning about climate change for years, and the way it's set up, like a change is sort of presented as something that occurs in the future.
Right.
You're going to change.
Yes.
You know, if it was climate changed, it would be a different deal.
Right.
But this idea that transition had already sort of irrevocably started to occur.
Definitely.
That was the first moment that I sort of managed to engage with that idea.
Right.
And I can't remember what the exact study was, but it has something to do, I think, with raising the temperature of the sea in a particular region off the coast of Florida or something.
Right.
But that theme stuck out to me then, and then, as you know, has just sort of continued and intensified.
Absolutely.
To the point where now... what was the name of that report that we were reading a year or two ago?
Oh, the ICC report.
The ICC report. That report is all about...
IPCC, I think.
Yes, IPCC.
The International Panel on Climate Change.
There we go.
Yes.
International Panel on Climate Change's report. And that was all about, you know, how we mitigate the extent of the change in temperature in the environment. What we can do, and their original proposal was that we should try not to hit 2 degrees Celsius in order to avoid the worst effects, and that they'd upgraded it a couple of years later, which was the report we were reading, to say that we shouldn't hit 1.5 degrees of raising, and that we were also straight dead on to hit that target.
I remember that in particular, the really big, one of the big takeaways I took from that was it outlined a timeline of how many years we actually have before we start to get into runaway climate change, or climate change that is verging into our worst case scenarios for what we can think. And it was about 10 years at that time.
Yeah.
So we have about 7 to 8 years now of action left, according to that report.
Of course. One of the huge things I got out of it was the importance and the utility of carbon tax. That this was sort of the baseline, the foundational proposal that was going to enable civilization to survive.
Absolutely.
That you needed to place a tax on the on carbon emissions. That if you didn't do that, then you weren't going to be able to leverage market pressures in order to prevent companies from emitting.
Right, exactly.
And it was about that simple.
Definitely. I'm on board with you with that. One of the things that was the big hot debate when we were younger was cap and trade or carbon tax. And, I'm glad that kind of we were both vindicated by the IPCC report on the merits of a carbon tax versus a cap and trade system.
I mean, cap and trade is in a way, it's a form of carbon tax, but it's basically just more business friendly.
Exactly.
It's kind of a soft carbon tax.
Yeah.
And obviously, you could alter it to make it a harder tax depending on the actual specifics of the thing. But that as sort of a foundational thing that forces markets to
actually change.
Because it's not what we've discovered through subsidizing green energy, which has been happening for a while now, is that it's just simply not enough. Yeah. Because the fossil fuel industry is just so powerful.
It's so huge. Absolutely.
So what are other things that you recall from that report, buddy?
So other things I recall from that report, well, that's where I actually began learning about the importance of agriculture. In climate change, and I hadn't really thought about this before. I knew agriculture was a part of a huge part of emissions, but and recently I'm going through the numbers again with what I've been, looking at with the EcoJust blog that I'm working on. But of course, I began to think about agriculture as this kind of driver of climate change in a really focused way, and around 25% of our emissions, based on the numbers I was just looking at, of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the agricultural sector. So that's a big number.
Yeah.
So huge,
Totally.
1/4 of all global emissions come from that. So I began to kind of think about
And that's a very small fraction of the economy.
It's a very small fraction of the economy, exactly, but a huge, social, a huge impact on our biosphere. Which is, which is kind of interesting. So I began to think about, okay, how to sort of look at these different spheres of where I, as an individual, could start to have an impact. And one of the ways I began thinking of is like, okay, I'm closest to organizations working on food security directly on the land. Okay, and this is actually, I can feed my 2 birds with 1 crust. I can keep doing that work while also being in the service of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a huge margin.
Right.
Trying to reduce that 25% or even contribute to further reductions through kind of innovative ways of using land is really, really cool. And I began thinking about that at the time of the report with some of that information coming out.
How land sort of interacts with, well, in a way it makes total sense.
Yes,
but,
exactly. I mean, the land is one of the big sinks, our carbon sinks in the,
Totally.
one of the big sinks that we have in our world.
And as you develop it, you release that out into the
Exactly.
world.
Exactly.
No, there are a lot of interesting things to me in that report.
Mm-hmm.
The formalization of carbon capture and sequester, or as normal human beings call it, growing trees.
Mm-hmm.
The limitations of it.
Yes.
They're like, carbon capture and sequester is great, but the best way we have of doing it is basically just putting more trees in the ground.
Yeah.
And trees take a while to grow.
Yeah, and not cutting down trees that already live, right?
Yeah, I mean that's not carbon capture and sequester, because that's just destruction of the
environment. Yeah, releasing more carbon.
But
yeah,
the whole, I think there's this belief that some people hold who believe that climate change is real. They're like, yeah, totally there, but also are just like, we'll figure out ways to capture this carbon back.
Yeah.
Technology will save us. It'll all be okay. And that sort of very clear line of, the best thing we have right now for getting carbon back is growing more trees.
Yeah.
Trees take a while to grow, and we're cutting down forests faster than we're growing trees.
Yeah, exactly.
That last point might need proof checking, but
no, absolutely. So recently,
I believe it is true.
For cutting down trees, the recent statistic I got was about 30 football pitches of forest are cut down every minute.
Mm-hmm.
That's from the stuff I was just looking at yesterday.
Totally.
So it was very drastic. Absolutely.
How much is being grown every minute?
I don't know. Definitely not that much, though.
gotta get that net, buddy.
Exactly. Well, and to go to land itself, it's really interesting because I was learning about how effective it is to, say, not only grow forests on land, which is incredibly important, but also just to return organic matter back to the soil.
Yes.
Yes, and that's a hugely effective way to do that. In some ways, that's easier than growing an entire forest, or something you can do in preparation or at the same time as you plant young saplings.
In tandem, yeah.
Exactly. Very much in tandem, but it's just to get that soil that is barren, desertified, living again is a really great way to kind of kickstart that carbon sequestration.
Of course, because all living things, all living plants basically suck in carbon.
Exactly, need it.
They live off CO2. So if you are fostering healthier environment, like I'm looking for that word, biomes isn't quite right. Ecology isn't quite right, but the interaction between animals and the plants and
ecosystems.
It's ecosystems.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
If you're fostering healthier ecosystems, then they're sucking more carbon out of the air.
Totally, absolutely.
And
the soil itself is an incredible carbon-based ecosystem. It uses a lot of carbon.
Because there's a lot of living stuff in that 6 inches or whatever it is.
Exactly. And building that back up is really, really key. So for me, that was kind of interesting, because I found it a little bit more hopeful than the reforestry stuff. Like, I think the reforesting stuff is incredibly important and needs to happen. And the preservation.
But it has huge challenges just in the basic nature of the fact that if you're reforesting, you're not getting old growth back.
No, you're not. So, and one of the things that I kind of really learned was that old growth relies on a very intense mycelium network. So
that's one of your favorite topics.
One of my favorite topics.
Talk to me about the mycelium.
So mycelium are really cool in that, that's how That's a lot of the ways through the interactions between roots of trees and fungi that the fungi get resources and give it to the trees, and the trees provide like sugars and other carbs to the fungi. That whole thing.
And the mycelium is essentially just the root network of the fungi.
Yeah, the root network of the fungi. And there's whole different ways they communicate with each other, or scientists are looking at and evaluating, is this a form of communication, the way they're able to redistribute resources and chemicals to each other. So it's fascinating. But anyway, part of that is like a really good mycelium requires a really healthy soil ecosystem to survive it. And so if you want to, get to the point where you get an old growth forest, or even accelerate the growth rate of a new forest, you need to have in place really healthy subsoil, really healthy soil horizons. And you get that by adding organic matter and starting kind of the way life started, with the basic sort of old organisms that bring about healthy soil.
And you build things up from there.
Exactly. And up from there.
It's one of the huge challenges about the whole climate change dilemma.
Yes.
Is that we're forced to try and make decisions and to interact with these ideas while having not only just a rough idea of the climate,
yes,
but also a really rough idea of just how these ecosystems work.
Exactly.
And interact.
Exactly.
It's one of the huge problems with this issue is that we're shooting so much in the dark.
Yes.
And yet, you have this really clear idea that this is a problem.
Yes.
I was reading, I might have told you about it a little bit. I read this book called Novacine, The Emergence of Hyperintelligence.
Right.
Is the subtitle. It's by this guy, James Goodlock, I think. He was 101 when he wrote the book.
Wow. James Lovelock?
Lovelock.
Yes. Gaia,
the Gaia theory.
Yes.
And there were a lot. I enjoyed reading the book a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of exciting stuff in there. There's in general his sort of Novacine idea I didn't think was very convincing.
Yeah.
The Gaia stuff I do enjoy. I think it's just, and especially it seems to have moved into the mainstream.
Yes.
Now it's become sort of an aspect of how people think about the Earth, especially in sort of more environmentally aware circles.
Definitely.
You are familiar with the Gaia theory. Why don't you fill us in?
Earth as a living organism.
Exactly.
There you go.
Yeah.
Named after Gaia.
Yeah.
I just a fun story. My dad sometimes used to in his class dress up as James Lovelock, so he'd get his hair all white and stuff like that, and he'd pretend to be James Lovelock for his students. So
that's funny.
He's very near and dear to my dad's heart.
Has he talked to him?
Yes, he has talked to him before. Yeah.
I was tempted to send him try and send him an email or something after reading this.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, he would love that.
Cool. Maybe I will do that.
Yes.
But I don't know. I found. He's clearly so knowledgeable and passionate and caring, and I thought his overall ideas about artificial intelligence and stuff were just not quite on the money.
Fair.
But we're here to talk about climate change, and what he was saying very clearly was that the Earth sort of is happy, cool.
Yeah.
That's one of the things he felt like he'd really taken away from all of the stuff that he'd learned. And that sort of resonated with me, this idea that if the Earth is cold, then, in this weird sort of balance between the sun and the Earth, then the Earth is kind of winning the battle against being overheated and having the atmosphere going off.
Right.
If the Earth is cold, then it can sort of hold on to its atmosphere and keep what's going on.
Right.
If it gets too hot, it all flies away.
Right.
And obviously, we need the atmosphere.
Yeah, to live,
And you remember, I can't remember if this was in high school or not, but this sort of description of, I think it was a Mr. Maharaj thing probably, of how thin the atmosphere is.
Yes, that's right. Can you remind me of that?
I believe it was, if you take a regular size globe,
right,
and you put a layer of varnish over it, the varnish would be the atmosphere.
Right. Yes.
It's thin.
Yes.
And it's basically just held here by the fact that we're making enough of it on Earth.
Absolutely.
That what escapes is replaced.
Yeah.
And there's some other things that go into that.
Right.
But, it's kind of, it's being held here on a balance.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that is just basic on a chemical level is that as things get hotter, they vibrate more and they bounce off of things more.
Right.
Which means that the atmosphere as a whole gets more energy pushing it away.
Right.
So that sort of that idea of the Earth, of Gaia being happiest when it's colder.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously, we don't want it to be too crazy cold, but that combines for him with this idea that there are things that happen that spike temperatures.
Right.
Volcanoes go off. Asteroids hit the planet.
Right.
There are these things that happen that just cause an erratic jump in temperature that damage the environment.
Right.
And that if your environment is cold, then there's that wiggle room.
Right.
It's cold. Asteroids
Volcanoes can go off a little bit more. It's okay.
The degrees, it spikes, it comes back down.
Right.
But if you're already hot and then one of these catastrophic events occurs, then everything blows up.
Right.
And this, for me, was a really good way of sort of incorporating one of the things that I think is problematic about the way people see the environment.
Right.
And that is this idea of catastrophic events and how they relate to climate change.
Right.
Because overall, we both know from the research we've done that as the climate change occurs, you don't actually see that many more like really obvious, super crazy things happening.
No, exactly.
Where it really affects things is all across the board, and sort of the little averages changing.
Yeah.
And that is problematic because if people suddenly, if there's a year where suddenly there's giant hurricanes everywhere and all this stuff, crazy stuff's happening at the same time, people would notice.
Right.
But a gradual change in averages, that's hard for people.
And that's hard for people to understand, and that's why it's taken a really long time, I believe, just from the simple fact that seeing's believing,
Yeah, totally.
For people to kind of wake up. But I think we're getting to the point where those changes in averages are reaching a point where it's visually obvious to people who have been geographically sheltered from that, Stuff's been going on in the global south for a really long time. Island nations flooding over, and they've been clamoring at the international community to do something about it for over a decade, but it hasn't been visualized here, and now I think it's starting to be with, in particular with wildfires, but with, I remember back in 2014 or 2015, the first part of the continental United States was flooded, and it was down in the Mississippi Delta, and it was a kind of, there's a lot of French-speaking, Cajun-speaking people, and they became the first internally displaced climate refugees in the United States. And now, of course, there are a lot more people who are internal climate change refugees, particularly along Miami, with the flooding, and along the low-lying parts of the United States.
And as people do more research in further years, we'll discover that certain groups of people we didn't previously think were climate refugees were.
Exactly.
Just as the nature of how research is done.
Exactly. So I think that's another thing that people are starting to pick up on. It's, one thing if it's happening on, thousands of hundreds of miles away. It's another thing if it's happening
to Americans
in your state next over, or even within your state. You're going to hear about it in a different way.
All of a sudden, there's a politician who represents those people in Congress.
Exactly. So, that's another thing as well. So, I think out of that, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the political changes that we've seen in terms of, how, if that's a good, where kind of, we've been looking at this for a while, but are kind of people making decisions thinking about this differently, and that's kind of can you talk about that at all? Is that something you've been thinking about?
Totally. No, there's been lip service by politicians to climate change for a long time.
Yes.
For most of our lives.
Yes.
Seeing that start to turn into action.
Yes.
It did start to turn into action during the Obama years.
Yes.
In the U.S. Certainly, we could probably do a full episode on Obama, shockingly enough.
Yes, absolutely.
Because there are, and obviously our perspective of him has changed a lot.
Right.
Because his brain was really through sort of intellectually forming years for us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So the way we viewed politics and how hopeful we were about how things could change,
yes.
all of that was being formed sort of amidst Obama.
Yeah.
In so many ways, especially after Bush, who I'm sure was a real tragedy in your family, and certainly in mine.
Absolutely, yeah.
The hopes were incredibly high.
Yes.
And in all sorts of ways, people were disappointed by the level of change they expected to see in the world,
right,
compared to what was produced, and climate issues are no different from that.
Absolutely.
And obviously there's deep politics that goes into this as well.
Right.
But stuff like trying to prevent oil drilling in certain places as much as he could.
Yes.
Stuff like engaging and giving the EPA certain powers and the ability to do things and expanding its brief.
Giving it some teeth is really key. Yes.
These ways of sort of working with the government.
Yeah.
And to my knowledge, it's during Obama's time, and maybe history will look differently on it, that the modern era of politics and the way the U.S. government works between its multiple branches has been sort of developed. So the idea of the president sort of acting on his own and passing these presidential decrees,
executive orders,
and the sort of breakdown of bipartisanship in America. And climate change is a very bipartisan issue.
Absolutely.
Though these days, I think it's still a bipartisan issue to a great degree.
Right.
But it does seem, as one of the hopeful things that strikes me about the politics,
definitely,
is it does seem like people, and I'm curious what you think about this, it does seem to me like people on the other side have woken up to the idea that this thing is happening.
Yes.
And the full denial is no longer what's going on. It's more like a soft denial that we don't actually need to do anything about.
No, exactly. And I would completely agree with you. I mean, even the Trump administration, which was horrible for environmental policy in the United States, acknowledged climate change. It was just, Trump himself did, I think, early on. But it was this exactly what you said, this sort of idea that, it's too late, we can't really do anything about it, we should focus on other things, let's just shove it under the rug a little bit. And that was coming from Trump directly. I think as well is that it's very hard to deny climate change now versus when we were growing up, and I think there has been a pivot in the strategy for that. One of the things I'm kind of really sort of interested that I think even the wealthy in kind of our region of growing, our interest, some of them are really, really interested in climate adaptation and growing.
I mean,
it affects them.
Having the world continue to exist is kind of a common human desire.
So, for example, which was really interesting, at this climate adaptation summit that just happened in January, which because even though it was incredibly sort of fitted out with world leaders like Angela Merkel went, Boris Johnson went, Modi went, Pope went. It got very little international news conference, but one of the big folks there was Bill Gates, and Bill Gates is really, really interested in agriculture right now. He's now the largest land owner in America. He's bought more land than anywhere else. And I'm not a flag bearer for Bill Gates by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I wouldn't expect so.
No, but he has kind of put forward, and his foundation has put forward a huge commitment towards a strategy of getting the latest farm enhancement technologies in the hands of small-scale farmers in the global south. And even that commitment to me is very fascinating, that he's playing, he's always played ball with international organizations, but he's very much pivoted towards this is where his focus is right now. At least a very obvious focus of his foundation is now on, climate mitigation, global food security, and providing livelihoods and access to tech to small-scale farmers.
Yeah. And I think things like carbon tax definitely feed into this.
Yes,
sort of thing.
Definitely.
I think one of the huge changes that has sort of enabled this, because honestly, I think one of the easiest criticisms to make of Bill Gates' his foundation and his work, without getting into too many details, is just that it's a very follow organization,
yes,
and not a very lead organization.
Yes.
As the world kind of figures things out, then they kind of chip along, and sometimes they don't help so well, and sometimes they do help in better ways. But one of the reasons that I think this is an easy thing for him to follow on is because in the way that we are producing energy has started to shift.
Yes.
And the way and the sort of our reliance on fossil fuels is still prevalent.
Yeah.
But as really in our lifetimes, alternatives have started to not only emerge but actually gain a foothold in the market.
Recently, I think it was Europe declared basically, didn't they? I have to look again, but it was like they either committed to a switch to fossil fuels or stated that they're becoming less. The majority of their energy is no longer fossil fuel dependent, or they've clearly committed to that goal by a very short spell of years. I apologize, I have to look at that. But one of the big things for me is that this is this is what the EU is saying now. It's like the EU is very clearly moving away from fossil fuels, and they are stating that
Europe has been remarkably good on this front.
Exactly.
And there are also good. One of the benefits of the Europe situation is there are really good socio-political reasons for them to move away from fossil fuels too.
Definitely.
Including the simple fact that it will tear a lot of Eastern Europe away from Russia
exactly.
if they can shift them onto natural fuel.
Definitely.
There's a ton we can talk about here. I keep on having ideas about what we can do for the next
definitely.
episodes. But to try and stay somewhat on topic. How do you feel about how hopeful are you feeling about there's all these different parts in the economy, there's all this different stuff. How hopeful are you feeling about the ability for all these changes to come into effect and actually sort of avert some kind of change?
Absolutely. I think, in North America right now, if the election didn't go the way it did, I would be very much in the pits of despair. I think so far Biden has shown with some of his executive orders and his pipeline stuff that he's not playing ball in the way that previous administrations have with the really environmentally destructive forces.
I think there are places where he can just, he can really pull support from all the Democrats.
Exactly, absolutely. And probably some of the Republicans, especially in southern parts of the United States that are affected by climate change, and their constituents are affected by climate change. I think he can really kind of coalition build, and I think he's starting to do that. And making climate change one of the 4 pillars at his inauguration of his upcoming administration was very, very key for me.
We both registered that.
Exactly.
It was very clear, to be fair.
What's that?
He was very clear about it.
Yes, he was very clear about it.
He set forth 4 priorities.
Exactly, 4 priorities, and one of which was climate change.
As we go into his term, I think we will hold him.
He gave us very 4 clear ways to evaluate him.
And I appreciate that.
I appreciate that too. So that I think is very, very key, because Trump did a lot to destabilize our environmental regulations, and that was sort of one of the things that I'm researching now, and kind of going back and looking over what exactly he did and what the damage control situation is. A lot of that was able to sort of slide under the rhetoric and just general chaos of his persona. So rebuilding and making sure that the institutions that are already in place to protect our environment, we undo the damage that he did and then kind of step up what needs to happen is a really sort of important process. I am hopeful that we can do that now. We've got the Senate. The Democrats have the Senate. The Democrats have the House. There's a Democrat president,
How critical do you think these next 4 years are going to
be? Immensely critical. Yeah. Immensely critical.
Because if, projecting deep forwards and knocking on wood, that Biden makes it through to a full 8-year double term, that would kind of cover the last chunk of this up until when you're supposed to be done that 1.5 degree aversion.
Definitely. And
what we were talking about earlier with the IPCC. And
we need to have a Democrat in office in order to accomplish that. That's just the reality that it is, So that's, if we had Trump for 4 more years, this would have been chaos, Now that we have Biden, it's a tall order for him, but we really need, I think, whatever his version of the Green New Deal is.
Right. So let's talk about the Green New Deal.
Talk about the Green New Deal.
We're getting tight, but
maybe this will where we'll end on. Do you want to? Yeah. What are your thoughts on the Green New Deal?
So, we talked about it quite a bit when it was going down.
You're right.
And, I was surprised that it got so much press.
Yeah.
That it was pushed so hard, and if you read it, you will discover, I think, as I did, that it's not really a plan.
Right.
In fact, I think calling it a plan would be very, very generous. It's more like a sort of a manifesto of ideals.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we these are some things that we think are important.
Absolutely.
And that we value going forwards, and that one of the things I think about me. Well, let me come back because I'm trying not to jump parallel.
No, totally. Yeah.
So it's a plan, and that leads me to evaluate it very cautiously.
Yeah.
And the reason it leads me to evaluate something like that, it's not a plan. It's sort of a set of ideals.
Right.
That leads me to evaluate it very cautiously.
Yeah.
And the reason that leads me to evaluate it very cautiously is because my way of evaluating political action and politics is based incredibly heavily in policy.
Right.
It's your ability to state clear policies, to explain how you are going to get what you are going to get done.
Absolutely.
It's why something like there's so many obvious reasons why Trump didn't pass the smell test.
Right.
But it was the most basic aspect of everything he was saying was they had no policies.
Yes. Yeah.
Like people would be like, "Randy, he's talked about building the wall." It's not a policy.
No.
You're just like, "I'm going to do this."
You don't talk about how you're going to do it.
He could have been talking about literally shooting the moon.
Yeah.
And people would have been like, "Well, that's policy."
That's what policy. Space Force.
The policy is he puts a brick here and then he puts another brick there.
Oh, absolutely.
You need to tell me how you're going to get it done.
Yeah.
Where the money's going to come from.
Yeah.
What taxes you're going to invoke. It's something like for any sort of big plan.
Yeah.
I want to know what your first steps are.
Absolutely.
And honestly, that's such a high bar in politics these days. Most people don't pass.
No.
Most people. It was my another podcast idea.
Yeah.
It was my thing with Bernie Sanders was that on a basic level, I thought that he was talking a lot of really good talk about sort of the overall direction and the ideas about how it would be nice for the U.S. to work. But when it came down to brass tacks, the individual first steps weren't there.
Yeah.
I did not see how he was going to shift things over. There are basic criticisms that it seemed like he didn't do a great job of handling.
Right.
Like to make education free for everyone. That's great, but there's a lot of people who can really afford to pay for education.
Yeah. Absolutely.
In fact, a lot of kids who are going can afford to pay.
Yeah.
Are we really going to subsidize all of them as well?
Yeah.
In a country with 500 million billionaires or whatever it
totally.
is.
No, I hear you on that.
But sorry, to cycle back to actual climate stuff. Those like basic policy steps.
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And something like the Green New Deal, does not deliver that in any way. So that, for me, makes me have to evaluate it as not a plan, as not a policy.
Yeah, it's not providing the points A to B, analysis of how we get...
I'll let you get in right after this.
Problem.
What I evaluated it as then was as a piece of propaganda, essentially, as a piece of popularized media, as something to like push around the world and be all like, check this out. This is what we kind of want to do in the future.
Right.
Yeah, man, this is what we want the future to look like. And that's a totally different thing. And I was amazed at how successful it was as that.
Definitely.
That people were paying attention to it. They were talking about it. They were spreading it. That, conservatives were giving it incredible amounts of lip service.
Yeah.
Which is sure, whatever.
Yeah.
But that feeds directly back into democratic media.
Yeah, exactly.
If the right-wing media is talking about it, the left-wing media starts to talk about it more.
Exactly.
And that, in a bizarre way, that ends up promoting these ideas to more and more people. So, sorry, talk to me about
No,
that.
absolutely. I think that's really key. And, the memification of it, or turning it into a meme, is really, what I noticed as well about it. And, I think if you're starting to get people excited about something, yes, you need the plan. But I think to just getting people sort of on the playing field of, okay, this is not only possible, we've done it before, because the whole idea of the Green New Deal is harkens back to the New Deal, where we actually did do a bunch of really important things very quickly with really sort of clear policy decisions that made sense to me, at least. I think it's one of the most the New Deal is one of the most remarkable pieces of legislations ever. It was truly it was truly amazing getting that done. And I think that's the kind of scope that this is going to take. So for me, something that's really fascinating is, I think, with the Green New Deal, if it doesn't provide the plan to get there, I think, what it can start to do, and I remember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about this, is sort of revivifying or putting resources into organizations that already exist that do the type of work needed to adapt to climate change. So one of the organizations is AmeriCorps. So AmeriCorps does ecosystem restoration. Right. I used to work for them. So I know firsthand what they're trying to do. And I think that is providing jobs, providing funding to those organizations, is a really clear end goal of something like the Green New Deal. Of course, I don't know how to get the money to do that, right? That's an incredibly important piece. But for me, at least, seeing something that articulated, this is where the money can go, that will have a direct impact on what we're trying to do for farming.
Totally.
Keeping biosphere alive, creating ecosystems that are more effectively sequestering carbon. This makes sense to me. This makes absolute sense to me. So, as I learn more about the political system in both the U.S. and Canada, and trying to get more involved in it, I want to kind of, connect the dots on that, because I see the end goals really clearly in a lot of ways, and I see really concrete ways, like getting a bunch of young people out working in our ecosystems and trying to make them resilient is, I think, really, really effective at reducing emissions.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get there?
Yeah.
That's kind of what the question I'm sort of looking at now.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think, I guess and I said it at the time, I believe, when we were talking about it. But the thing that I still think about the Green New Deal is that, it's succeeded in that sort of way,
yes.
I believe. But it was still, like, what I want is the plan.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like that's beyond people to do. And
No,
I think you,
absolutely.
You, when I talked to you about it, might have brought up that book right
yes,
there.
Yes, Drawdown, that's right.
Which provides more of that sort of plan. But,
exactly.
Has frankly not received a fraction of the press.
No, it's true. And Drawdown's really cool in that this is for everyone, I think I suggest everyone pick it up. This is the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, edited by Paul Hawkins. So Drawdown is when we actually start to become carbon negative. We start to sequester more carbon than we're putting out, which is also a key piece of kind of climate adaptation now. Is taking stuff out of the atmosphere at a rate faster than we're putting it in to sort of mitigate the effects of climate change.
We've got to go over that hump.
We got to go over that hump, exactly. So these are really clear, cool policy options in here, because it talks about policy as well as tech and just other stuff going on. It's 100 different ways that I think, should exactly, as you said, receive this, a comparable amount of attention to something like the Green New Deal.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah.
All right. So to wrap up here, as we usually do.
Yes.
And I think this is a good moment to transition into this question, which is...
Yes.
What do you want to see in the future that has changed about the climate?
Oh, man.
Looking back 5, 10, 15 years, tell me both what you want and what you think is going to happen. Do you think we're going to hit that 1.5 degrees Celsius mark? Do you think we're going to hit 2?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think we're looking more to 2. on if I'm being completely honest.
Pessimistic, yeah.
Yeah, but I think, if we can get the ball rolling on some of these very clear things that work, and start to really kick them into high gear within the next 5 to 10 years, I'm going to be hopeful. I'm going to be hopeful that if we shift things around to prioritize these types of things, get the money in place to do that, then I'm going to be hopeful that we're going to come through this thing out the other side and be okay as a species,
Yeah.
How about you, man? What do you want to see when you look back 5 to 10 years from now on our climate? We're just thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that we look back and we see that the fossil fuels basically died.
Yep.
I would really like to see a world where the things that we value and that we think have been provided by fossil fuels are still maintained.
Yes.
Because I think they're incredibly valuable, and a lot of times when you're talking in more environmentally activist circles, people are like, well, it'll just be a future where we never fly anywhere again. And as somebody who lives 500 miles away from their mother, and, 2,000 miles or something absurd away from my entire English family, that's not a world that I want to see occur.
No, absolutely.
And I think there are just more and more people like that now, and there are going to be more and more in the future.
Definitely.
Who have families that are just spread across the world, and preventing those people from seeing those other people who are important in their life is, I think, an issue.
Yes.
And I think it's a good thing that people spread. So in a very basic way, I want there to be a world. I would really like it if we could just make that 1.5 degree mark.
Yeah.
Honestly, prediction-wise, I've been feeling pretty good lately, so I'm going to try and shoot for the lower one.
Shoot for the low. Yeah, that's good, man.
We'll see how it goes.
I hope you're right,
We'll come back, yeah, I know.
Absolutely.
I think you probably have the upper hand in the pessimistic prediction, but honestly, it may not even be that pessimistic. So
yeah, we'll see. But I'm hoping. I want to shoot for 1.52, man.
I was amazed. The point where I guess I'll come off, and of course you can react to this as well. But I was amazed the other day because I was just like I can't afford a car. I'm nowhere near affording a car. But I was just idly looking at electric cars. Yeah. And I was looking at electric charging stations because I was curious what the distribution was.
Right.
And whether, and just like in a basic way. Yeah. My mom's down in Philadelphia. Right. If I had an electric car, could I go and visit her? Right. Because it's too long of a trip for me to make in a single charge. Yeah. And the answer is basically yeah.
Yeah, you can do it.
There are really just enough charging stations. There's enough super fast ones.
Yep.
Like you basically have to stop at a particular place for 20 minutes, half an hour. Yep. And then you hop in your car and you finish your journey.
And you keep going, man.
So that is a real, that's reaching a moment. There are people who live on the other side of the United States, and that's still totally doable. Yeah. I think batteries, assuming that those vehicles get better, obviously I think that, and we can do a whole thing about transit. This one's just been all ideas.
Yeah, a lot of ideas there, yeah.
I don't think that cars are the best way to move people remotely.
Definitely.
But our infrastructure is there for it right now, and we need car companies are a big deal still. Yes. And giving them a way to move into the new world without totally imploding is good. For the fossil fuel companies, they've chosen their path and they can all die.
Definitely. No, I hear you on that.
Unless we need them to run plays.
But your point about you notice it in the details, like the angel in this case, the angel is in the details rather than the devil. I hope is that people are doing this around the world, whether it's making kind of electric transportation feasible, regenerating their small scale farms. They are actually doing it. They are turning the tide in this. They are turning things around. It is possible, and it is when you look at this. Climate change is a big kind of kaleidoscope of issues. It's incredibly difficult to see positivity in it. And I speak from the personal perspective.
Because it's just so big.
It's so big.
So interrelated with awful crap.
Exactly. But when you break it down and actually, step by step, do that kind of connect the dot process, just look at what people are doing all over the world, it is incredibly helpful,
Totally.
And another hopeful thing is that I do think the money is there. One last thing before we go is that around this is a crazy statistic. The 50 highest food producing countries in the world spend about $700 billion on land use strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Most of those land use strategies are utter crap. They are destructive and degrade the land. But that's still money, and these are policymakers that are talking about this in the Climate Adaptation Summit. That money can be redirected into positive avenues that actually restore and regenerate land, and it is possible to make amazing strides in a few years on landscapes that are totally devastated.
And in some weird, basic way, for a lot of our agriculture, we kind of get another shot every year.
Yes, we do. We get another shot every year. And you can if you do proper land use practices, you can see results in less than 5 years on a landscape that has been completely depleted of its biosphere. You can actually rebuild ecosystems. Totally. And just to have examples of that and illustrate those for people is incredibly important. We can do it, You can get to Philadelphia, and I can transform somebody's backyard, man. And that's something. That's something.
All right, buddy.
All right,
Thanks
buddy.
so much.
Thank you, man. This was a good one. Nice.
Let's hope there were clearly quiet bits in that audio. And there were clearly loud bits. It was hard to because it seemed like we balanced it pretty well.